Welcome back to The Talking Point. I'm sure you all heard of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. One day Ukrainians are living a normal, peaceful, modern life, and the next day they're walking to the Romanian borders on foot. Reminds me of when my grandfather had to walk from Palestine to Jordan after the British gave Palestine to Israel. Ukrainians don't know if they'll ever get to go back home. It also reminds me of millions of Palestinians. But one of the major costs of war is how many people get displaced. For most of us, it's not relatable, and it's only news on social media that we could easily scroll and ignore. But for most people, it's more depressing, and I think we can all agree that it's a bad thing. It's always a bad thing when a conflict comes to this level, whether with refugees or fighting. It's always bad. And this is what people forget about war, because sometimes you hear about a war in another country and you're like, oh, that's sad, but why should I care? It's over there. But you should care, because we're all connected, whether it's the refugees crisis, the rise of gas prices, and the stock market. But one glimmer of hope for these refugees is that all Ukraine's neighboring countries are welcoming them with open arms. I mean, it's interesting that Eastern Europe has been willing and able to accept 1 million of people in their countries in just a few days, when just recently didn't seem to have any space for a different group of refugees. Joining us now, our guests.
With the European response to refugees from Syria, but not only Syria and Iraq, but also refugees from Africa, Yemen wars and many other, let's say people who are not white, people who are not Christians, and people who don't look like Europeans, all right? They're not blue-eyed, blonde, a variety, or they don't have white skins. They have been treated very obviously, in a completely different way. And the crisis in Syria and Iraq was creation not of Russians. It was a creation by the West. It's the West that unraveled Syria and Iraq. It is the Americans who invaded and wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein and chose that path to do that. So in other words, when you also weigh responsibility, who is responsible for the creation of this crisis? What we see, double, triple, I don't know what kind of standards you want to call it. It's more than double standards. It is. They have a responsibility, but they have shirked that responsibility. And in fact, the media and some of the more, let's say, less liberal media and less, and even liberal media for that matter, have labeled these refugees as terrorists, as, in the worst possible way, labeling them. Once you label them and the media carries it, and which is what majority of the people see, because they're not in direct contact with the refugees. So what the media focused on in this case is the color of their skin, their religion, their ethnic background, okay, rather than their hardships, their conditions of children, women. Is it easy for somebody to kind of just wind up with 2 bags, leave your home, your family, your neighborhood, everything, and become refugees in tents, uncertain life? This is the most difficult thing to do. I mean, ask anybody in the West, how would they feel if they had to one fine morning are being bombed and they have to just gather what they can and flee their homes? I don't think that there is an empathetic understanding of the hardships and the kind of impossible conditions that these refugees have to face. Ukrainian refugees certainly deserve help. There is no question about that. But it is really the response that one is questioning on part of Europe. A real fear of the kind of refugees that are coming in. They cannot be integrated easily. They're not white European Christians. They will always be different. They'll have their own communities. So there'll be like little pockets of refugees who cannot be integrated in the European civilization. All right, European civilization meaning Christian civilization. So there is this fear of the, it's a very ethnically, racially informed perception, all right, and judgment. It's a judgment, all right. There are deeper causes, and one can go to the immediate recent history of the past, the turmoil in the Middle East, and the wars in the Middle East. Now we can debate about who's responsible for war and so on. In my mind, there is no debate. I think the destruction, the attack on Iraq, 2003, was the most stupid thing that the United States ever did, and they unraveled Middle East as a result, because all these refugees also went to other parts of the Middle East, and they have been accepted. But I wonder how well they are doing. Are they really integrated? Okay, as the Palestinians were integrated, it took very long time, but Palestinians still live in refugee camps. Okay, even to this day, after 70 years of history. So I am not sure that refugees from Middle East are welcome, even among the countries in the Middle East, especially the oil-rich countries, which have a very different perception of this whole turmoil. And they're much closer to the United States, and they do not really want to upset the US and upset the Western countries. So there is a whole calculation that goes on in there. So those are the international causes, but there are deeper cultural causes, you see, and those were best described by, Edward Said, who was a professor at Columbia. He's no more, but he wrote a monumental study of where this racism comes from. And he traced it all the way back to the 19th century, when the Europeans were colonizing Middle East and various parts of it. And there were a lot of Europeans who were also greatly admiring. There were some European scholars who went and studied Arabic, and they began to understand this, and they wrote about it. He even analyzed those texts that were supposedly admiring of this culture, and found that there is very deep-seated cultural standards where Europe and West was civilized, while the East is not civilized in this way, okay? And it's very, very telling. The East, and I by East, I mean not only Middle East, but particularly Middle East, going all the way to India and further, to East Asia. Okay, so Asia and West Asia is very much a part of it, is considered to be feminine as opposed to the Western civilization, which are masculine. It's supposed to be, East is supposed to be irrational, impulsive, emotional, dangerous. You understand? There is this whole characterization that comes out of the study of the European literature about languages, culture, religion of the Middle East and Asia. So he wrote this thing called the Orientalism, the book is called Orientalism. And he traces that in paintings and everything, that was written or said by the Europeans about this. The Americans have inherited that. They have very little understanding of the culture, the fact that these civilizations are so much older, but they have a different history. So there isn't any real empathetic or a genuine deeper understanding of this. It is all very superficial. It's all very it's very media based. People in the media don't have time to study anything. They have to meet deadlines and report, and they do that by sitting in 5-star hotels, and talking to each other, and maybe talking to some informers, but there isn't really venturing out into the field to really understand what people are going through, etc. So there is this whole business about, first of all, a built-in prejudice cultivated for centuries about this part of the world. On top of that, you have the turmoil that happened in the Middle East, partly internal, partly because of the external forces, beginning with the Arab-Israeli wars and onwards, you see, and then the rise of fundamentalism, Osama bin Laden, the Afghan wars, then the Iraq invasion, Syrian war, and the total dismantling of many of the regimes, but nothing stable came out. There was that Arab Spring, but the Arab Spring did not last. Even in Egypt, we have back to military rule. So we have the failures that are partly internal to those societies. And one can go into explanation as to why it would happen. We don't have time for that. But there are also external meddling and external interference and external pressures that have accelerated the process of dismantling and instability in this part of the world. So looking at then the history from the outside, it's very unstable, okay? It's full of turmoil. People are fighting each other. They're fighting on ethnic issues, okay? So they are primitive. They're sort of not civilized. They're still talking about religion. They're still so these perceptions are reinforced. Those Oriental perceptions are reinforced by recent perception of events, and then of course the whole challenge by the radical Islam, okay, has been a serious problem. America declared war on terrorism. The terrorists were also internal within the United States. They were outside everywhere. So that has gone nowhere, and so it's rather a long kind of answer to your question, but it does tell us as to why. It's not enough to just say, because they're afraid of refugees bringing in terrorists in disguise and disrupting their societies and so on. But there is this fear of the unfamiliar. There is a fear of the race. There is a serious race issue involved there. And this is being broadcast, or a certain perception is being promoted by mainstream media. It doesn't have to be Fox Channel, it's mainstream media. What they focus on tells us where their priorities lie. And they're not focusing on the conditions of the refugees. They're focusing on the war and how bad Russia is. There's lots of causes, not a single cause thing that you can say, well, this is why Europeans are doing that. That's again a very simple shorthand explanation of why Europeans are not responding. Okay, but racism needs to be unpacked. Ethnic, ethnic prejudices need to be unpacked to see where they come from. Why have they originated? It's not just enough to label it and say Europeans are this way or that. The Europeans have been, in fact, more, they have settled more refugees from the Middle East than United States. United States took only 40,000, if I remember correctly.
It's very strange. When it's Syrians who are fleeing a war, it's all, we do not have space, do not come. But now there's a space and people must come. What changed? When Syrians needed a refuge, even the camera crew was drop-kicking families. But now Ukrainians are getting accommodations, visas, and work benefits, which is a good thing. But I'm just saying, where's their dropkick? And look, we don't even have to speculate about why they treat Ukrainians differently than refugees from Africa or the Middle East. It's because people from African and Middle Eastern countries are uncivilized, according to a European journalist who was choosing his words carefully. I'm your host, Rayah Hammad. See you next time.